After my father's funeral, she dumped me in the freezing woods. His empire is mine now. I stood in the mud as she sped off. No phone. But she had no idea what he secretly left me. The nightmare began exactly 2 hours after we lowered my father into the frozen Connecticut ground. The November air was bitterly cold, carrying that sharp, metallic scent of impending snow that always seemed to cut straight through my thin black wool coat. My name is Evelyn, and at 33 years old, I stood at the edge of my father's grave, acting as the silent, uninvited spectator to a theatrical performance of grief. My father, George, was an absolute titan in the commercial real estate world. He had built an empire of glass and steel from the ground up, but over the last year, his brilliant mind and strong body had failed him with terrifying speed. Standing across from his grave was my stepmother, Cassandra. She was dressed in pristine designer mourning clothes that probably cost more than most people make in a year. She was pressing a delicate lace handkerchief to her perfectly powdered cheek, wiping away completely invisible tears for the benefit of the wealthy business partners and city politicians in attendance. Beside her stood her biological son, Derek, looking completely bored out of his mind. He kept shifting his weight and checking his luxury watch, clearly annoyed that the priest was taking so long to deliver the final prayers. They were the absolute picture of a grieving, devoted family. But I knew the dark, ugly truth. They had been waiting for this exact day for years. As the crowd finally began to disperse, heading toward the line of waiting black cars, Cassandra walked over to me. Her face was a masterclass in gentle, maternal concern, but her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely dead. She reached out and touched my arm with her gloved hand. She spoke softly, projecting her voice just enough for the remaining guests to hear what a generous woman she was. "Evelyn," she whispered, squeezing my sleeve. "I know we have had our differences in the past, but your father would want us to be civil today of all days. Let me give you a ride back to the city. It is literally the absolute least I can do. I should have known better. I really should have." I had not lived under their roof since I was 18 years old, when Cassandra successfully convinced my father to throw me out so Derek could have the entire spotlight and all the resources. I had built my own life in New York City entirely from scratch. I read people for a living and I read numbers. But in a brief, exhausting moment of genuine grief, my defenses were lowered. I made a mistake. I agreed to get into her luxury sport utility vehicle. The absolute second the heavy, soundproof doors of her car clicked locked, the grieving widow act vanished entirely. The polite mask melted away. Cassandra stared straight ahead as she merged onto the highway, her jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. We drove in suffocating, heavy silence for 40 agonizing minutes, heading away from the city lights and deep into the rural, wooded outskirts of the state. I watched the scenery outside the tinted windows changing from familiar highway exits to dense, dying woods and empty, frozen fields. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "This is not the way back to the airport or the city." Cassandra did not answer me. Instead, she suddenly slammed her heavy designer boot on the brakes. The massive vehicle swerved violently onto the shoulder of an abandoned, unpaved logging road, kicking up a massive cloud of gravel, dead leaves, and freezing mud. My seat belt locked hard against my chest, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. Before I could even process what was happening or unbuckle myself, Cassandra threw the car into park. "Get out," she snapped. Her voice was completely devoid of any emotion. It was the tone you use when taking out the garbage. I stared at her in genuine disbelief. "We are miles from the highway." "Cassandra, what are you doing?" I said, "Get out." She leaned aggressively across the wide center console, grabbed the handle of my passenger door, and shoved it wide open. The freezing, biting autumn wind immediately rushed into the heated cabin. With frightening, practiced speed, she reached into the back seat, grabbed my heavy travel suitcase, and hurled it out onto the wet dirt. Then, she snatched my leather purse right off my lap. "Hey," I shouted, instinctively grabbing for the strap, but she ruthlessly yanked it away. My cell phone, my wallet, my identification, and my credit cards were all inside that bag. Cassandra looked me dead in the eye with a terrifying, victorious smirk. "This is where you get off, Evelyn. You never belonged in our world anyway. The house, the money, the trust funds, and the business are all mine now. Do not even bother coming to the reading of the will this afternoon. You are getting absolutely nothing." She shoved my shoulder hard, forcing me backward out of the vehicle. My boots hit the freezing mud. Before I could regain my balance, she slammed the heavy car door shut and locked it. The engine roared aggressively as she slammed her foot on the gas. The tire spun, spraying wet dirt across my legs as she sped away, leaving me completely stranded, alone and penniless in the middle of nowhere. I stood there in the swirling dust, shivering as the cold wind whipped my hair across my face. Any normal person in that situation would have completely panicked. They would have cried or screamed or chased after the fading red tail lights of the car. But I did not do any of those things. I just stood there in the absolute silence of the woods, watching her drive away, and allowed a small, cold smile to form on my lips. Cassandra honestly thought I was still that helpless, terrified 18-year-old girl she had successfully thrown out of the house 15 years ago. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I knelt down in the freezing mud and grabbed the heel of my left boot. It was a custom-made, heavy leather boot designed specifically for my line of work. I dug my fingernail into a hidden, reinforced seam near the thick heel and unzipped a concealed, waterproof compartment. From the hollow space inside the sole, I pulled out two vital items: a fully charged, encrypted satellite phone and a heavy, black metal emergency credit card. As a senior forensic accountant who spends her days hunting down dangerous corporate criminals and exposing money laundering syndicates, I learned a very long time ago never, ever to leave my survival in a single handbag. I powered on the satellite phone. It found a signal through the dense trees, and I dialed a highly secure private number. It rang exactly twice before my executive assistant back in my New York office answered. "I need a private extraction," I said, my voice completely steady and utterly calm, despite the freezing air. "Send a helicopter to my current GPS coordinates immediately." "Understood, ma'am," my assistant replied efficiently. "Shall I have the pilot route you straight back to your apartment as originally planned?" I looked down the empty, desolate dirt road and slowly brushed the wet mud off the sleeves of my black coat. "No," I replied, my tone hardening. "Cancel my flight back to the city. Tell the pilot to take me directly to the law offices of my father's estate in Manhattan. I have a will reading to crash." I ended the call and slipped the heavy satellite phone into my coat pocket. I just stood there in the chilling silence, staring at the deep tire tracks Cassandra had left behind. She thought stripping away my resources and leaving me stranded in the cold would break my spirit. But she fundamentally misunderstood the woman she had just tried to destroy. When I was 18, Cassandra had whispered poison into my father's ear day after day. She painted me as a rebellious, ungrateful liability to his perfect corporate image, while constantly elevating her own son, Derek, as the flawless, beautiful heir. My father, whose mind was already clouding with the early, tragic signs of his illness, eventually surrendered to her relentless psychological manipulation. I was given exactly 1 hour to pack a single bag and shoved out the massive oak doors of our luxury estate. Most teenagers would have crumbled under that kind of absolute rejection. I almost did. I slept in cheap, dangerous motel rooms on the outskirts of the city. I survived on instant noodles and tap water. But the burning, pure anger inside my chest turned out to be a far better fuel than grief. I worked 3 exhausting, mind-numbing jobs just to put myself through college. I studied financial law and accounting late into the night until my vision literally blurred. I realized very early on that the world is entirely run by money, and the people who control that massive wealth always, without fail, leave a paper trail. That realization became my absolute obsession. I did not just want to build my own wealth. I wanted to understand the exact anatomy of greed. I wanted to know precisely how people like Cassandra dismantled the lives of others, so I could learn exactly how to dismantle them in return. That intense, unwavering drive pushed me to the absolute top of my field. Today, I am the person federal agencies quietly call when corrupt billionaires try to hide their stolen wealth. I spend my days tearing apart complex offshore shell companies, piercing corporate veils, and dragging financial criminals kicking and screaming into the harsh light of justice. The distant, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors suddenly pulled me back to reality. The sound grew louder, vibrating in my chest, until a sleek, black private chopper appeared over the tree line, cutting sharply through the gray autumn sky. It hovered overhead, sending a violent storm of dead leaves swirling around me, before gracefully descending onto the deserted gravel road. The side door slid open, and a security contractor pulled me up into the warm, leather interior. The door slid shut, sealing me in a quiet bubble of power. We lifted off, leaving the dirt road far below. I was no longer a victim. The hunt had officially begun. The flight from the rural woods of Connecticut to the towering steel canyons of Manhattan took less than 30 minutes. When the helicopter finally touched down on the private roof pad of the skyscraper, I did not hesitate for a single second. I stepped out into the biting city wind and walked straight toward the executive elevator. I deliberately chose not to wash the dirt from my hands or brush the dried mud from the hem of my expensive coat. I wanted them to see exactly what they had tried to do to me, and I wanted them to know it had failed completely. The law offices of Mr. Gregory occupied the entire 50th floor of the building. It was a fortress of extreme wealth, decorated with polished mahogany floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an intimidating, heavy silence. I strode right past the bewildered receptionist, completely ignoring her stammered protests, and marched directly down the main corridor. I pushed the heavy oak doors of the primary conference room open with enough force that they slammed hard against the walls. The sound echoed through the massive room like a gunshot. "That is a fascinating creative writing exercise, Cassandra," I said, stepping into the room, instantly interrupting her fake, sobbing story about how I had run away in a hysterical fit of grief. The lawyer, Mr. Gregory, an older man in a sharp gray suit, looked up over his reading glasses in absolute shock. Cassandra's fake tears vanished instantly. The color drained completely from her heavily made-up face as she stared at me like I was a demon rising from the grave. Her mouth hung slightly open, but no words came out. Sitting next to her was Derek, leaning back in an expensive leather chair with his feet arrogantly propped up on the polished wood table. He nearly choked on his vintage champagne when he saw me. Sitting in the far corner, looking completely detached from their morbid celebration, was Fiona. She was Derek's wife, a brilliant corporate attorney, and a woman who had endured years of Cassandra's subtle condescension and passive-aggressive hostility. Fiona sat perfectly straight, her dark eyes analyzing everything, completely ignoring her husband. She was the only person in the room who did not look surprised to see me. I pulled out the heavy leather chair directly opposite Cassandra and sat down, crossing my legs. I deliberately rested my mud-stained boots on the edge of the table, right next to Derek's polished designer shoes, leaving a very visible trail of dry dirt on the pristine wood. "Let us get this over with," Derek sneered, slamming his glass down, his face flushing with anger. "Read the document, Mr. Gregory. So she can take her pathetic scraps and go back to whatever shoebox apartment she crawled out of." Mr. Gregory cleared his throat nervously, shuffling the thick stack of legal documents. He unsealed the heavy envelope containing my father's final wishes. He bypassed the standard legal preamble and went straight to the distribution of the primary assets. The tension in the air was so thick you could practically cut it. "To my wife, Cassandra, I leave my controlling interest, equating to 90% of the shares in the George Commercial Real Estate Group," Mr. Gregory read. Cassandra let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, looking over at me with a sickeningly sweet smile of utter triumph. It was a corporate empire valued at over $150 million, handed over to a woman whose only actual business experience was spending other people's money. "To my stepson, Derek, I leave the primary family residence located in Fairfield County, along with all its furnishings and vehicles," the lawyer continued. Derek pumped his fist slightly under the table. He had just inherited a $15 million mansion without working a single day of his life. Then the room fell completely silent. Mr. Gregory looked down at the paper, then looked up at me with an expression of deep discomfort. And to my biological daughter, Evelyn, I leave a one-time cash disbursement of $10,000. Cassandra actually laughed out loud. She quickly covered her mouth, pretending to cough, but the sheer delight in her eyes was unmistakable. $10,000. In their world, that was the equivalent of pocket change. It was a calculated insult designed to remind me of exactly how little I supposedly meant to him. "There is one more item directed to Evelyn," Mr. Gregory said. He pulled out a small, sealed envelope and slid it across the long table toward me. "Furthermore, I leave Evelyn the contents of Safety Deposit Box 818 at the main branch of Chase Bank in Manhattan. Included in this envelope is the physical key." Derek burst into loud, arrogant laughter. "Wow," he mocked. 10 grand and a rusty key to a metal box. That is poetry right there. Here is a little extra for cab fare." He peeled a crisp $100 bill from his money clip and tossed it across the table. It landed right next to my dirty boots. At the far end of the table, Fiona suddenly pushed her chair back. The harsh scraping sound drew everyone's attention. She stood up, her face set in a mask of pure, cold disdain. "It is suffocating in here," Fiona said, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any sympathy. "I am not going to sit around and watch the charity case beg for more scraps. I am leaving." She grabbed her sleek leather briefcase and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. To reach the exit, she had to walk directly past my chair. As she drew level with me, she deliberately veered to the side. Her hip forcefully slammed into my shoulder, knocking me slightly sideways. "Take your pennies and leave, orphan," Fiona snapped loudly, her voice echoing off the glass walls. It was the perfect distraction. In the exact fraction of a second when her body completely blocked the sight line of Cassandra and Derek, I felt something entirely different from hostility. Her hand brushed quickly and precisely against my open palm resting on my lap. Her elegant fingers pressed a tiny square of folded paper firmly into my skin. My reflexes kicked in instantly. I closed my fist tight, concealing the paper before anyone could blink. I played my part flawlessly, shooting her a cold glare as she stormed out of the room. I slowly stood up, slipping the envelope with the key into my coat pocket. I looked down at the $100 bill Derek had thrown. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I brought the heavy, mud-stained heel of my boot down directly onto the center of the bill, grinding the dirt permanently into the expensive carpet. I turned my back on them and walked out of the conference room. The game had completely changed. I strode down the long, quiet corridor of the law firm, my face completely blank. The moment the polished metal doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing me alone in the quiet car, I opened my tightly clenched fist. The tiny piece of paper Fiona had passed me was slightly crumpled from the heat of my palm. I carefully unfolded the thick white cardstock. It contained exactly 2 sentences written in sharp, precise black ink. "The PIN for box 818 is your mother's death date. Check the Cayman Island accounts." It was signed simply with a single capital letter F. I stared at the slip of paper as the elevator began its rapid descent. My mind instantly shifted into analytical overdrive. Fiona was the lead corporate attorney handling the transition of my father's massive real estate company. If she knew about Cayman Island bank accounts, it meant she had seen the hidden ledgers. In my profession as a forensic accountant, Cayman accounts are the ultimate red flag. They are offshore tax havens used almost exclusively by the ultra-wealthy to hide massive amounts of illicit money, dodge federal taxes, and launder stolen corporate funds. And if Fiona was secretly feeding me the highly secure PIN to the safety deposit box, it meant my father had trusted her enough to give her the code before he died. He knew Cassandra would never let me anywhere near his documents without a vicious fight. So, my father had planted a silent witness deep inside her own camp. Fiona was not just a disgruntled daughter-in-law acting out of spite. She was an inside operator, and she had just handed me the exact coordinates to blow Cassandra's entire financial empire to pieces. The elevator chimed loudly at the lobby. I stepped out into the bustling Manhattan street and immediately hailed a black car to take me to the main branch of Chase Bank in Lower Manhattan. The drive took only 15 minutes, but my mind was racing through 1,000 different complex financial scenarios. A safety deposit box pin tied to my late mother. Offshore Cayman accounts. Fiona risking her career and her marriage to hand me the keys. My father had known the end was coming, and he had meticulously prepared a financial battlefield specifically for me. I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the bank and approached the private client desk. I presented my identification and the physical key I had received at the law firm. The bank manager examined the credentials closely before giving me a polite nod. He escorted me to a highly secure private elevator that descended deep beneath the bustling city streets. When the doors opened, the air grew noticeably cooler. We walked down a long, silent corridor lined with thick steel vault doors. He led me into a massive room filled from floor to ceiling with thousands of polished metal boxes. Box 818, the manager said, gesturing to a mid-size compartment. Please enter the digital pin on the keypad to disengage the secondary biometric lock. I stepped forward and typed in the 6 digits corresponding to the tragic day my mother passed away. A soft green light blinked, and a heavy mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. The manager inserted his master key, turned it, and stepped back, allowing me to insert my physical key. The heavy steel door swung open. He pulled out the long rectangular metal container, placed it on a polished oak table in a small private viewing room, and discreetly closed the door, leaving me completely alone in the absolute silence of the subterranean vault. I took a slow, deep breath before reaching out and lifting the hinged lid of the metal box. Inside, there was no cash, no expensive jewelry, and no sentimental photographs. There were only 2 thick manila folders resting neatly at the bottom. They were the tools of my trade. They were weapons. I reached into the metal box and pulled out the first folder. It was heavily labeled as a confidential toxicology report from an independent private laboratory. I opened the cover and began to scan the dense medical data. My father had suffered from a severe heart condition and relied on a very specific daily medication to keep his heart rhythm stable. But as my trained eyes tracked down the columns of numbers highlighting his blood serum levels over his final 3 months of life, a sickening, terrifying pattern emerged. The concentration of his life-saving heart drug had inexplicably and rapidly plummeted. In its place, the laboratory found dangerously high traces of a heavy, unauthorized sedative. A sedative that actively suppressed cardiac function. Someone had been systematically replacing his daily capsules. And there was only one person in that massive house who was entirely responsible for administering his daily medications. Cassandra. The air in the tiny, underground viewing room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I had to grip the edge of the oak table to steady myself. Cassandra did not just manipulate my father into signing over his commercial empire. She had actively orchestrated his death when he started asking too many questions about the missing company funds. A cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones, freezing my blood. This was no longer just a bitter financial dispute over an inheritance. This was a capital murder investigation. And I had the absolute smoking gun right in my hands. I carefully set the toxicology report aside, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and picked up the second folder. It was surprisingly heavy, bound with thick legal twine and stamped with an official state notary seal. I opened it and stared at the title page printed in bold black ink. It read, Blind Land Trust Agreement. As a senior forensic accountant, I deal with overly complex corporate structures every single day. I know exactly how to strip away the confusing legal jargon to find where the actual money is buried. I began flipping through the pages, rapidly scanning the core clauses, the transfer dates, and the beneficiary designations. The document was flawlessly executed exactly 3 years ago, long before my father's brilliant mind began to fade. It detailed the creation of an ironclad, irrevocable trust designed specifically to hold real estate assets in complete, impenetrable secrecy. I followed the asset schedules listed in the back of the document, mapping the physical properties to the corporate structures I knew my father owned. Then I read the final execution clause, and all the breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. I had to read the paragraph 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The George Commercial Real Estate Group, the company Cassandra had just proudly inherited, owned 10 massive, luxurious skyscrapers in the state of Connecticut. But according to this legal document, the company did not own the actual dirt those skyscrapers were built on. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, there is a mechanism known as a ground lease. My father had quietly severed the land from the buildings. He transferred the ground titles directly into this blind trust. And the sole beneficiary and absolute executor of that trust was me. Cassandra owned the bricks, the steel, and the glass. But I owned the very earth beneath them. My father did not leave me nothing. He left me the master key to everything. He had allowed her to build her entire fraudulent empire on land she did not actually own, waiting for the day I would come to collect. I spent the next 48 hours locked inside my darkened Manhattan apartment, fueled by black coffee and sheer, unrelenting adrenaline. The room was illuminated only by the cold, blue light of my 6 oversized computer monitors. The physical evidence from this safety deposit box was secure, but to completely annihilate Cassandra and Derek, I needed the digital proof of their financial crimes. Thanks to the clue Fiona had given me, I knew exactly where to aim my weapons. I initiated a direct cyber assault on Cassandra's private Cayman Islands accounts. For someone who honestly thought she was a brilliant criminal mastermind, she used shockingly basic encryption. I bypassed her offshore banking firewall in under 12 minutes. Miles away in Connecticut, I knew a bright red, high-priority security alert was flashing aggressively across Cassandra's laptop screen, informing her of an active data download. I could practically picture the expensive champagne glass slipping from her trembling fingers. I watched the progress bar on my center screen hit 100%. 5 years of her heavily guarded financial history flooded onto my secure servers. I pulled up the primary ledger for the George Commercial Real Estate Group on my left screen and cross-referenced it with Cassandra's private Cayman Islands trust on my right. As a forensic accountant, I do not just look at raw numbers on a spreadsheet. I look for the story the numbers are desperately trying to hide. Fraud always leaves a distinct signature, a pattern of human greed. I ran automated software scripts to highlight anomalies in vendor payments, offshore wire transfers, and sudden spikes in operational expenses. The pattern emerged almost instantly, painting a picture of absolute, devastating corporate rot. Cassandra was not just stealing pocket change from the company. She was executing a highly coordinated financial shell game on a massive scale. I traced a series of huge wire transfers disguised as legitimate payments to independent contractors for property maintenance, structural upgrades, and luxury renovations. But when I ran the tax identification numbers for those supposed contractors, they all looped back to a single, hollow holding company registered in Delaware. A company that was wholly owned by Derek. They were bleeding the corporate operating budget completely dry and funneling the cash directly into their own pockets to fund his luxury cars and her endless designer lifestyle. But petty embezzlement was not enough to put them away in federal prison for the rest of their lives. I needed to see the much bigger picture. I widened my search parameters, digging into the corporate valuation reports filed just 3 weeks ago. That is when I found the heavily guarded prospectus for an upcoming mega merger. Cassandra was preparing to sell the entire commercial portfolio to a global investment firm for $120 million. The historic signing was scheduled for a massive gala at the Plaza Hotel in just a few days. My eyes darted across the projected revenue columns, and the sickening truth suddenly clicked into place. She was not just hiding her theft. She was deliberately cooking the books to artificially inflate the value of the company before the sale. By categorizing their stolen millions as capital improvements and falsifying tenant rental yields, Cassandra was making the real estate group look twice as profitable as it actually was. It was a classic pump and dump scheme on a massive corporate scale. If she successfully signed that merger contract, she would walk away with a massive payout, and the buying corporation would be left holding a worthless, hollowed-out shell wrapped in massive hidden debt. The digital evidence I had just acquired was damning. But to trigger an immediate raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I needed more than just digital spreadsheets. I needed the documents bearing their physical, wet signatures. I needed Fiona. If you are enjoying this story of calculated revenge so far, please take a quick second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are currently living in. Every single like and comment helps this video reach more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the story. While I was meticulously dismantling her entire life from the shadows, Cassandra was busy planning the party of the century. Over the next few days, the corporate world in New York was buzzing with the news of the upcoming mega merger. Cassandra had officially announced that the global investment firm had agreed to the $120 million buyout. But simply signing the legal documents in a quiet, private boardroom was absolutely not enough for her massive ego. She needed an audience. She needed everyone in her wealthy social circle to witness her ultimate triumph. She rented out the grand ballroom at the historic Plaza Hotel, sparing absolutely no expense. She ordered thousands of imported white orchids, hired a world-renowned symphony orchestra, and invited every major business reporter in the city to cover the historic signing ceremony. Her very first official order of business as the new chief executive officer was a complete corporate purge. Within 2 hours of taking over my father's corner office, Cassandra systematically fired every single loyal executive my father had employed for the last 20 years. The chief financial officer, the vice president of operations, and the entire senior advisory team were all handed cheap cardboard boxes and escorted out of the glass building by armed security guards. Cassandra did not want anyone around who actually knew how to read a balance sheet or question a missing invoice. She immediately replaced the seasoned executives with a team of highly paid sycophants whose only job was to blindly approve her fraudulent expense reports and prepare the company for the massive buyout. All she had to do was keep the corporate shell looking highly profitable until the buyers signed the final contract on Friday night. Meanwhile, her son Derek was completely drunk on unearned power. He strolled into the corporate headquarters acting as if he had built the entire empire with his own 2 hands. He even used the corporate marketing and promotional budget to execute a long-term lease on a brand-new, cherry red Ferrari. It was a $400,000 machine purchased purely for his own vanity, parked illegally in the executive loading zone directly blocking the main entrance. When Cassandra weakly scolded him about using the corporate operating account right before an acquisition audit, Derek simply waved his hand dismissively. He arrogantly told his mother that the buying corporation was going to hand them $120 million in less than a week, and the payoff would easily cover his massive spending habits. They were completely blinded by their own limitless greed, utterly unaware that the federal government was quietly building a massive steel cage around their entire empire. I parked my unmarked rental car 2 blocks away from a run-down diner on the dark, industrial edge of Queens. The neon sign buzzed loudly above the entrance, casting a flickering red glow over the wet pavement. I pulled my heavy black coat tightly around my shoulders and walked inside. The smell of stale coffee and cheap fried food hit me instantly. The place was completely empty except for one person sitting in the very back booth, hidden in the shadows. Fiona was wearing a dark trench coat over her expensive tailored suit. Her posture was completely rigid, her sharp eyes rapidly scanning the dark parking lot through the greasy window. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from her. We did not bother with any polite pleasantries. I assured her I had taken 3 different subway lines and a cash cab before renting the car under a false name, making sure nobody had followed me. Fiona exhaled slowly, the intense tension in her shoulders dropping just a fraction. She reached deep into her coat pocket, but kept her hand hidden beneath the sticky table. I looked at her, studying the deep exhaustion behind her intelligent eyes. I asked her why she was doing this. She was legally married to Derek. If Cassandra went down and the entire company collapsed, Derek would lose absolutely everything, which meant Fiona would lose everything too. Fiona let out a bitter, hollow laugh that did not reach her eyes. She leaned forward and told me exactly what her life had been like for the past 5 years, trapped inside Cassandra's perfect little white picket fence empire. Fiona had graduated at the absolute top of her class from a prestigious law school. She was a brilliant corporate attorney. But to Cassandra and Derek, she was nothing but a convenient prop. She was the diversity hire they paraded around when the board members asked uncomfortable questions about corporate culture. Behind closed doors, she was treated like the absolute help. She described the daily microaggressions, the constant condescension, and the subtle racism woven into every single interaction in that massive house. Cassandra would frequently ask Fiona to fetch her coat or pour coffee for the junior executives at senior board meetings. Derek never once defended his wife. He just laughed along and told her to stop being so overly sensitive. He had married her because he liked the idea of a smart, beautiful woman on his arm to make him look modern and progressive, but in reality, he expected her to be his obedient, silent servant. Fiona finally pulled her hand from beneath the table. She placed a small, black encrypted flash drive on the scratched surface right between us. She explained that when Cassandra started creating those fake Delaware holding companies, she needed someone to draft the legal framework. Cassandra thought Fiona was just a highly paid secretary who would blindly process the paperwork without ever reading the fine print. But Fiona tracked every single dollar. I looked down at the tiny piece of plastic. Fiona looked me dead in the eye and told me that the drive contained the high-resolution optical scans of every single wet signature Cassandra and Derek put on those illegal contracts. There was no digital manipulation. There was no plausible deniability. It proved clear, malicious intent to defraud the shareholders. She had handed me the bullet. Now, I just needed to pull the trigger. I left the diner with the flash drive securely tucked into the hidden pocket of my coat. I drove back to my secure apartment in Manhattan, locked the heavy deadbolts behind me, and immediately booted up my primary workstation. When I inserted the drive, the decryption software ran for a few tense seconds before the files populated across my monitors. Fiona had delivered exactly what she promised. There, in crisp, high-resolution optical scans, were the physical contracts. Cassandra and Derek had signed their names in bold blue ink right next to the fraudulent financial declarations. It was the undeniable physical proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. I spent the next 3 days building the perfect digital execution file. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew exactly how federal prosecutors liked their evidence packaged. I did not just send them raw data. I built a comprehensive timeline cross-referencing the forged signatures with the offshore Cayman Island wire transfers and the artificially inflated corporate valuations. I laid out the entire $120 million pump and dump scheme so clearly that a first-year law student could have won the conviction. I opened a secure, encrypted communication channel to a senior director I frequently worked with at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. I attached the massive data packet along with a secondary secure file directed to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit. I recommended freezing all associated accounts immediately upon the execution of the warrants. The trap was officially set. While I was meticulously polishing the guillotine, the immense pressure was finally starting to fracture Derek's arrogant facade. For days before the grand merger gala, Derek was locked inside his expansive new office, sweating completely through his custom-tailored silk shirt. His burner phone had been vibrating relentlessly. Derek had a severe gambling addiction that he had carefully hidden from his mother for years. He had bet heavily on underground sports syndicates, assuming the corporate merger money would arrive in time to cover his massive losses. But the highly dangerous bookies operating out of Atlantic City were done waiting. The final text message he received was painfully clear. He owed $2.5 million by midnight on Friday, or they were going to pay a highly publicized, violent visit to the gala. Derek paced the length of his office, frantically running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was completely trapped. He had already drained his personal trust fund to buy the $400,000 Ferrari and fund his extravagant lifestyle. The corporate reserve accounts were locked down tightly pending the final merger audit. If he asked Cassandra for the cash, she would absolutely lose her mind and potentially cut him out of the new venture entirely. The heavy glass door to his office quietly clicked open. Fiona walked in carrying a stack of legal folders. She took one look at his pale, panicked face and instantly knew the trap was primed. She had been monitoring his frantic phone activity all morning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She was about to hand her husband the exact rope he needed to hang himself, and she was going to make him believe it was a lifeline. Fiona closed the office door behind her and walked over to Derek's massive mahogany desk. Her expression was perfectly molded into one of gentle, wifely concern. She asked him if everything was all right with the acquisition paperwork. Derek jumped slightly, snapping defensively that he was just dealing with some minor operational delays. Fiona walked around the desk and placed a comforting hand on his trembling shoulder. She kept her voice smooth and entirely unthreatening. She gently reminded him that she was the lead corporate attorney, and if there was a sudden cash flow issue, she could easily draft a short-term internal promissory note. She explained it was a completely standard procedure. They could use the corporate operating capital as a bridge loan and quietly repay it the absolute second the merger funds cleared on Friday night. No one ever had to know. Derek froze. His panicked mind desperately grasped at the lifeline she had just casually tossed into the water. It sounded so clean, so professional. He asked her if he could authorize a direct wire transfer from the holding company accounts today without triggering an automatic board review. Fiona smiled warmly, nodding her head. She told him that as long as he categorized it under the emergency structural renovation budget for the Delaware properties, the automated accounting software would process it as a standard vendor payment. She even offered to generate the fake vendor invoice for him right then and there, so the paper trail looked completely legitimate. It was a masterful psychological manipulation. Derek let out a massive sigh of relief, a smug, arrogant smile returning to his face. He actually leaned forward and kissed her hand, completely oblivious to the cold calculation in her dark eyes. He opened his laptop, logged into the secure corporate banking portal, and frantically typed in the offshore routing numbers the bookies had provided. The system prompted him for his unique biometric thumbprint and his digital signature to release the millions. Derek pressed his thumb against the scanner and confidently clicked the bright green button to execute the wire transfer. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a loud, victorious laugh. He thought his problem was solved. But the moment he clicked that button, the money did not just quietly move to Atlantic City. Down in Washington District of Columbia, a massive red alert instantly illuminated the primary monitoring screens at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The wire transfer had tripped the exact surveillance wire I had set up with the federal agents. The final nail had just been driven into his coffin. Later that afternoon, a bonded courier knocked on the door of my apartment. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope sealed with custom gold wax. Inside was a VIP all-access pass to the merger gala at the Plaza Hotel. Cassandra simply could not resist the urge to be cruel. She had gone out of her way to track down my secure address just to twist the knife one last time. Clipped to the glossy invitation was a handwritten note. It read, "Evelyn, come watch me sell your daddy's legacy. Wear something nice for the cameras." I stared at the note, feeling a deep, cold, absolute calm wash over me. I walked over to my closet to pick out the perfect armor for the evening. I had commissioned a custom-tailored masterpiece of midnight black silk. The structured blazer bodice featured sharp, aggressive shoulders that flowed seamlessly into a sweeping floor-length skirt. The subtle gold accents caught the light like polished steel. I tied my dark hair back into a sleek, uncompromising knot. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry. My confidence and the devastating secrets I carried were the only accessories I needed. I slipped into the back of a private town car. It was time to burn her empire to the ground. Friday evening arrived with a chilling wind, but the atmosphere outside the Plaza Hotel was blazing with chaotic electricity. Searchlights swept across the dark Manhattan skyline, while a thick red carpet stretched all the way down the marble steps toward Fifth Avenue. A frantic swarm of photographers and financial reporters fought against the velvet ropes, waiting to catch a glimpse of the woman who was about to close the biggest commercial real estate deal of the decade. The town car pulled up to the curb, and the moment my driver opened the door, the flashbulbs erupted. I stepped out onto the red carpet, ignoring the shouted questions from the paparazzi, and walked purposefully up the marble stairs. As I reached the heavy brass doors at the top of the steps, two massive security guards in dark suits suddenly stepped directly into my path, forming a solid human wall. The taller guard held up a thick hand, informing me that my VIP pass had been explicitly revoked by the host, and they had strict orders to forcefully remove me if I caused a scene. I was just about to escalate the situation when the heavy brass doors swung open from the inside. Fiona stepped out onto the landing, looking absolutely stunning in a deep emerald green dress. She held a clipboard in one hand and looked the towering security guard up and down with an expression of pure, lethal authority. She commanded him to stand down, stating loudly that as the lead legal counsel for the company, she was officially overriding that order. She declared me a primary shareholder and her personal guest, forcing the guards to step aside. We did not even exchange a smile. She simply gave a curt professional nod and turned her attention back to her clipboard, playing her role flawlessly. I entered the massive reception area outside the main ballroom. The lobby was a sprawling sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. It did not take long for the golden boy to spot me. Derek was standing near the sweeping grand staircase, surrounded by four older men in immaculately tailored suits. They were the remaining independent board members of the company. Derek was laughing loudly, his face flushed red from a combination of vintage champagne and extreme stress. When he caught sight of my black silk gown, his arrogant smile twisted into a nasty sneer. He deliberately led the board members across the polished marble floor right toward me. He wanted an audience to publicly crush me. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Derek announced, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. He mocked my dress and told the board members I was just a bitter, estranged orphan begging for a handout before they signed the $120 million merger. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. I told him I was not there for a handout. I was just there to admire the financial genius of a man who manages to spend millions of dollars he does not actually have. Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes. "See what I mean? She is completely delusional." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. My voice was low, but razor-sharp. Delusional is using the corporate marketing budget to execute a $400,000 long-term lease on a cherry red Ferrari pending an acquisition audit. And I am certainly not lying about the $2.5 million wire transfer you authorized this morning from the corporate holding accounts. I watched his eyes widen in absolute terror as I recited the exact routing numbers from memory. I told the board members that he categorized it as an emergency structural renovation, but the money went straight to an offshore account controlled by an Atlantic City sports betting syndicate to cover his massive gambling debts. The silence that fell over the small group was completely deafening. The silver-haired board member stepped back, shaking his head in total disbelief, demanding Derek tell him I was lying. Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest heaved with panic. Without saying a single word, he violently shoved past the board members, dropping his crystal champagne glass onto the marble floor where it shattered into 100 pieces, and stormed off desperately searching for his mother. I did not wait around to watch the fallout of Derek's panic. I slipped away from the crowded lobby, heading directly toward the restricted access corridors. Fiona had conveniently left the service elevator unlocked for me. I took it up to the mezzanine level and entered the primary audio-visual control booth. The secure room commanded the lighting, sound, and projection systems for the entire grand ballroom. It was completely empty, just as Fiona had promised. I locked the heavy acoustic door behind me and walked up to the massive soundproof glass window. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the breathtaking display of excessive corporate wealth. Thousands of rare white orchids cascaded from the ceiling. But my eyes were fixed entirely on the brightly lit stage positioned at the very center of the floor. Cassandra was standing behind a beautifully carved mahogany podium, looking like a reigning monarch in her custom silver gown. Beside her stood 3 senior executives from the global investment firm. Resting directly in the center of the podium was the massive, leather-bound merger contract. Cassandra was beaming, posing gracefully for the swarm of photographers, entirely consumed by her own vanity. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Derek forcefully pushing his way through the dense crowd at the front of the stage. His tailored tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. He waved frantically at his mother, but Cassandra just shot him a furious warning glare and waved him off, refusing to let his sudden panic interrupt her coronation. The lead executive from the purchasing firm stepped up to the microphone, delivering a glowing speech about the brilliant legacy of the company. Every single word he spoke made my blood boil, but I kept my hands perfectly steady. I reached into my silk clutch, pulled out the encrypted flash drive Fiona had given me, and plugged it directly into the primary projection console. I bypassed the standard hotel network and linked my feed directly into the massive digital projectors suspended from the ceiling. Down on the floor, the executive finished his speech to enthusiastic applause. A legal assistant handed Cassandra a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. The room grew quiet as the press pool readied their cameras for the historic shot. Cassandra lowered her head, bringing the gold nib of the pen down toward the thick parchment paper. I firmly pressed the master override button on the audio mixing board, grabbed the primary microphone, and flipped the switch. A massive, deafening screech of audio feedback blasted through the towering speakers, tearing violently through the grand ballroom. Everyone in the room flinched. The orchestra completely stopped playing. Cassandra dropped the gold pen in absolute shock, leaving a dark ink stain spreading across the first page of the contract. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, dead silence. Before you buy that company, gentlemen, you might want to look at the real balance sheets. My voice echoed like thunder across the massive room. I brought my finger down hard on the execute key of my laptop. Up on the stage, the glowing corporate logo vanished. In its place, a towering 50-foot display of undeniable financial treason illuminated the room. The very first image was a high-resolution scan of Cassandra's private Cayman Islands trust account. The raw numbers were massive, painted in bright red. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of expensive tuxedos. The only sound was the frantic clicking of 100 camera shutters. They were witnessing the live, public execution of a massive federal crime. Cassandra spun around, her jaw dropping in absolute horror as she stared up at the massive screen. She frantically waved her arms at the hotel technicians, screaming at them to cut the power, but I had locked the system behind a military-grade firewall. I advanced to the next slide, tracing the massive wire transfers from the corporate budget into Derek's fake holding companies. I displayed the fraudulent vendor invoices. The 3 senior executives from the purchasing mega corporation stood frozen, instantly processing the data. They recognized the offshore routing numbers. Cassandra turned back to the executives with a desperate, manic smile, stammering that it was a fabricated presentation by a disgruntled relative. She begged them to just sign the contract. But the lead executive did not take the pen. He was staring directly at the third slide, the physical internal contracts authorizing the fraudulent property valuations, bearing the unmistakable wet signatures of Cassandra and Derek in blue ink. It was absolute proof of intent to commit corporate fraud. The lead executive's face flushed dark red with absolute furious indignation. He realized this woman had looked him dead in the eye and confidently tried to rob his firm of $120 million. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen and threw it violently across the stage. "This company is a fraudulent shell," he yelled, his voice booming with rage. "You are a criminal, Cassandra. The deal is off." Without another word, the executives turned their backs and marched directly down the stage stairs, disappearing into the chaotic sea of panicked guests. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into absolute pandemonium. Through the massive glass window of the control booth, I watched the arrogant golden boy finally break. Derek was sobbing openly near the grand staircase, his hands buried in his hair, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his massive theft. But Cassandra was an entirely different breed of monster. Her sheer narcissistic survival instincts kicked in. She refused to accept defeat in front of the flashing cameras. She picked up the microphone the executive had abandoned. I stepped away from the audio mixing board, walked out of the sound booth, and took the service stairs down to the main floor. By the time I pushed through the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the ballroom, Cassandra was already launching her desperate counterattack. "Quiet," Cassandra shrieked into the microphone. Her manic voice echoed loudly, forcing the chaotic crowd to lower their voices. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the back of the room, searching the shadows for me. "So what if the merger is dead?" she screamed, her face flushed dark red. "I still own the company. I hold 90% of the controlling shares. You hear me, Evelyn? You thought you could destroy me with a few hacked spreadsheets, but you failed. I still own the 10 luxury skyscrapers in this city. I own the concrete, the steel, and the glass. They are worth billions. I can take out a dozen new loans against those massive properties tomorrow. You get absolutely nothing. You are still a broke, jealous orphan." I stepped out from the shadows and walked directly into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The moment the crowd saw me approaching, they parted like the Red Sea. My black silk power suit caught the bright lights, my expression as cold as ice. I walked straight down the center aisle, keeping my eyes entirely locked on the desperate woman standing on the stage. Cassandra screamed at the security guards to arrest me for trespassing, but absolutely nobody took a single step toward me. They had just seen the undeniable proof of her federal crimes projected onto 50-foot screens. I reached the front of the stage and stopped right at the edge of the red velvet ropes. "Are you sure you own them, Cassandra?" I asked, my voice echoing with devastating, absolute calm. Cassandra's eyes darted nervously. She snapped that her name was on the master corporate deed. I smiled a cold, sharp smile. I called out for Fiona to bring the documents. Fiona stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings, her emerald green dress catching the bright stage lights. She did not look like a subservient employee. She looked like an absolute executioner. In her hands, she carried the thick, heavy manila folder from the safety deposit box. Cassandra stared at her daughter-in-law in absolute bewilderment, screaming at her to get off the stage. Fiona ignored her completely, walking right past her to hand me the heavy folder. Fiona announced clearly to the silent room that as the lead corporate attorney, her ultimate fiduciary duty was to the legal owner of the assets, and as of today, that was no longer Cassandra. I took the folder and tapped a key on my laptop. The massive digital projectors instantly shifted, displaying the Blind Land Trust Agreement stamped with a massive red state notary seal. Cassandra mocked it, claiming a dusty old trust document did not override her controlling shares of the buildings. I picked up my microphone. "You are absolutely right, Cassandra. You own every single brick and steel beam of those 10 luxury skyscrapers. But in the world of high-level commercial real estate, there is a legal mechanism known as a ground lease. The physical building and the actual dirt it sits on are two entirely separate legal entities. 3 years ago, my father transferred the absolute ownership of the ground beneath all 10 of those skyscrapers into this irrevocable blind trust. And the sole beneficiary is me." A massive wave of shocked murmurs swept through the dense crowd. The financial reporters began furiously typing on their phones. Cassandra's face went completely slack. The horrific reality paralyzed her limbs. "Your multi-million-dollar company does not own a single square inch of the earth it stands on." I delivered the words with surgical precision. "You are not a real estate mogul, Cassandra. You are just a tenant. You are renting the dirt from me." I took one final step forward. "And according to the master contract my father drafted, your corporate ground lease expired tonight at exactly midnight. Because you have violated the primary covenants by falsifying property valuations and embezzling operating funds, the penalty clauses are triggered immediately. I am officially raising the corporate ground rent by 1,000%. Your company owes me $40 million in penalty fees and back rent, and that balance is payable in full right now." The number hung in the air like a massive executioner's blade. $40 million. Derek let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the bottom of the stage stairs. He knew the corporate accounts were completely drained. Cassandra stared at me for a long, terrifying moment. Then, a strange, frantic energy possessed her. She let out a loud, hysterical cackle that made the remaining board members physically step away from her. She gripped the microphone tightly and yelled that I was just an accountant who didn't understand corporate warfare. "Fine, raise the rent," she sneered, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. "Make it $100 million. It does not matter. If the company owes you $40 million and we do not have the cash, we will simply file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection tomorrow morning. The courts will freeze the assets, the company will fold, and I will walk away clean to my mansion. You will be stuck fighting bankruptcy lawyers for 10 years. You get absolutely nothing." She stood there panting heavily, believing she had just played the ultimate trump card, entirely confident that the corporate veil would protect her personal wealth. But she had completely forgotten about the brilliant woman standing right next to me. Fiona stepped forward and gently took the microphone directly out of my hand. She looked at her mother-in-law with an expression of pure icy calculation. "Actually, Cassandra," Fiona said, her voice ringing out perfectly composed. "You might want to hold off on calling your bankruptcy lawyers." Cassandra glared at her, but Fiona just smiled a cold, devastating smile. Fiona explained that when Cassandra and Derek started aggressively draining the corporate operating accounts, creating a severe liquidity crisis, they had to take out massive commercial loans from 3 different private equity banks. Because Fiona was the lead corporate attorney, Cassandra trusted her to draft all the loan agreements, always too busy planning parties to actually read the fine print before blindly signing. "Private equity banks are not stupid," Fiona stated sharply. "They required absolute collateral. When you and Derek signed those loan documents, you did not just sign on behalf of the Limited Liability Corporation. You signed a full, unconditional personal guarantee. And I personally notarized the signatures." The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Derek fell completely to his knees, burying his face in his hands. He knew exactly what those words meant. "It means the corporate veil is completely pierced," Fiona's voice dripped with absolute finality. "If the company goes bankrupt tomorrow, the banks will instantly call in the debts. They will legally seize your $15 million mansion in Fairfield County. They will seize Derek's Ferrari. They will freeze your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and every single offshore trust you thought was hidden. And whatever is left over will go directly toward paying Evelyn her $40 million in back rent. You are completely and utterly ruined." The reality of the personal guarantee shattered the last remaining fragment of Cassandra's sanity. The elegant facade violently disintegrated. She let out a guttural, feral scream and lunged directly toward my throat. I did not even flinch. Before she could close the distance, 2 massive security guards intercepted her, violently wrestling her back. She thrashed wildly, her expensive silver designer gown tearing loudly along the seam as they hauled her toward the service exit. Down on the main floor, Derek scrambled forward on his knees, desperately grabbing the hem of Fiona's emerald green dress, sobbing and begging her to save him from the Atlantic City Syndicate. Fiona did not show a single ounce of pity. She smoothly slid her heavy diamond wedding ring off her finger and dropped it directly into Derek's half-full crystal champagne glass. She looked down at him with cold, clinical precision. She told him she had filed the divorce papers that morning and immediately frozen every single joint bank account and shared trust fund. She had also flagged his $2.5 million wire transfer as fraudulent activity, causing the federal banks to initiate an emergency lockdown. After the overdraft fees, he had exactly $12 to his name. Before Derek could even process his total destitution, a sudden, deafening crash echoed through the venue. The heavy brass doors burst open. A dozen men and women in dark tactical gear with FBI printed across their backs stormed into the room, followed by heavily armed detectives from the New York Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. The lead federal agent held up a thick stack of warrants, shouting for nobody to move. Agents immediately surrounded Derek, clicking heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. But the homicide detectives headed straight for the service corridors where Cassandra was being held. I followed closely behind them, handing the detective the thick manila folder containing the independent toxicology report. I stated clearly that my father was murdered and Cassandra systematically poisoned him. The detective scanned the laboratory seals, his expression hardening into pure stone. Cassandra shrieked wildly, thick spit flying from her lips, as the heavy steel cuffs clamped down hard around her wrists for capital murder. 6 months later, the bitter winter winds of New York City had finally given way to a bright, optimistic spring. But the change in seasons offered absolutely no comfort to Derek. He stood behind the greasy counter of a heavily trafficked diner in the deep industrial sector of Queens, wearing a stained polyester uniform. His previously manicured hands were now raw and covered in burn marks from the industrial deep fryer. The federal courts had completely liquidated every single asset he possessed, and the Atlantic City Syndicate had seized the pathetic scraps, leaving him to work off his massive debt in constant, paralyzing fear. Miles away in a maximum security facility, Cassandra sat rigidly on a cold steel bench. Her custom silver gowns had been permanently replaced by a stiff, bright orange canvas jumpsuit with an inmate number stamped heavily across the chest. With the mountain of undeniable physical evidence Fiona and I provided, the jury had taken less than 2 hours to convict her of wire fraud, embezzlement, and the capital murder of my father. She was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. She was utterly and entirely alone, trapped forever inside a cage of her own making. While they were drowning in the absolute consequences of their actions, I was standing in the center of the greatest transformation of my life. I wore a bright white hard hat and a sharp tailored blazer, standing on the edge of a massive excavation site in the heart of the city. The 10 luxury skyscrapers that once stood on this ground had been completely demolished. I had used my leverage as the absolute landowner to order the total demolition of all 10 buildings. The heavy wrecking balls had pulverized the concrete, wiping Cassandra's tainted legacy off the face of the earth entirely. In their place, a massive foundation of fresh steel was rapidly taking shape. Fiona stood right beside me, holding a thick roll of architectural blueprints. She was thriving in her new role as the chief legal officer and equal partner of our new firm, radiating an absolute commanding confidence. We were building a new empire from scratch, founded on transparency and relentless hard work. They drove me out to a deserted dirt road 15 years ago, and again 6 months ago, telling me I was completely finished. They threw my belongings into the mud and drove away laughing, entirely convinced they had buried me. But they did not understand the fundamental nature of the dirt they left me in. The dirt they left me in was not a grave. It was a foundation. And that brings us to the end of this journey. Rebuilding my father's legacy from the literal ground up took everything I had, but standing on top of my own empire made every single struggle worth it. Looking back, some people in my extended family told me I went too far by completely destroying Cassandra and Derek's lives, saying I should have just taken my land and left them alone. But after what they did to my father, I felt they deserved absolutely nothing less. So, I have to ask you, the jury, am I in the wrong here? Did I take my revenge too far, or did they get exactly the karma they deserved? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story of sweet, calculated revenge. See you in the next one.